First, I just want to say thanks to the organizers for their invitation and their interest. I'm super pleased to be here representing Institutions by Artists. It was a conference that was organized by a group of 5 key individuals in Vancouver, BC, by project manager Lorna Brown, an independent artist and curator, project assistant Marianne Borchex-Laporte, an artist and at the time a graduate student at Simon Fraser University, the programming chair Christina Lee Podesva, who's also an artist and the editor of Philip magazine, and our designer Jeff Kansari, who runs the imprint New Documents and is the publisher of Philip magazine. My role was as event manager, so I was a kind of coordinator in between many different people, and I now subsequently sort of work as the media art curator at Western Front. So at the time, Western Front was just one of the centers that we were affiliated with when we did this project, just so that it didn't come from the Western Front, but I'm here. So before I start, I was sort of inspired by this conversation I was having at lunch to just read a little bit from the Institution by Artists reader, and I will return to Vincent Bonnet again, but I wanted to just briefly introduce by saying, so he begins an essay that we commissioned for this project. Here, Bad News Always Arrives Too Late, Institutional Critique in Canada, 1967 to 2012, with a chronology. In 1967, London, Ontario, artist Jack Chambers received a letter from the National Gallery of Canada informing him that the institution was preparing to assemble a collection of slides on Canadian art. They asked for permission to reproduce a photograph of one of his works, while informing him that if he didn't react immediately, the duplication of the slide would be carried out without his permission. Chambers refused to collaborate with the gallery and sent a copy of the letter detailing his refusal to 130 fellow Canadian artists. Following this dispute, he founded the Canadian Artists Representation, CARFAC, whose goal was the establishment of fair policies for artists in regards to intellectual property. On January 3rd, 1969, Vasilakis Takis broke into the MoMA and took back his kinetic artwork, Telesculpture, from 1960. Presented in the exhibition, The Machine as Seen at the End of the Mechanical Age, curated by Pontus Hulten, though the piece was owned by the museum, Takis claimed that his repossession of the work would be a necessary act, demonstrating artists' rights to retain control over how their work is presented. Following this gesture, he distributed a communique entreating his peers to establish a forum where they might discuss the social function of the museum as well as the apathy of cultural institutions toward the Vietnam War. Later that year, several of his colleagues, Carl Andre, Rosemary Castoro, Hans Hake, Lucy Lepard, Tom Lloyd, Willoughby Sharp, and Wen Ying Se would found the Art Workers Coalition with the goal of denouncing the collusion of art museums within the military-industrial complex. So this goes on. There's several other examples in here. This is the beginning of his essay in which he begins to speak about this problem of institutional critique within the Canadian context. So I wanted to kind of counterpose those two things. I began with this, I'm going to return to Vincent, but I also wanted to foreground our names and the gathering together of us as individuals within the Canadian context. We were trying to bring together a public articulation of meaningful dialogue about artist-run culture, and while we worked together in a very practical manner, organizing, planning, implementing this large-scale event, we also shared an interest in autonomous practices, self-determination, and strategies that artists have used to circumvent norms or traditions and build on the promise of cultural and social alternatives. Christina Podesva states in the opening of the Institutions by Artists reader here, that though the institution of art may have come to be defined as the museum and the gallery, this is a theoretical conceit. Contradicted by both history and by practice, it has nevertheless demonstrated a remarkable discursive endurance, more often than not stalling the art institution in the ditch of the museum and the gallery. In response to this discourse, we sought to expand on the idea of the institution through a conceptualization of institutions by artists, loosely defined as the co-articulation of artists and their institutions via a process of sociality and mutuality. So that was sort of driving us. An important note about how it came about, our conference was funded through a sort of small seed allocation from a local organization called the Pacific Association of Artist-Run Centers, a committee of peers in the Artist-Run Center community who represent the different various spaces on the West Coast. We used the money that they allocated to raise funds for 2 seasons, and throughout those seasons, we came to realize enough funds to put on the project. But afterwards, when the project ended, we disbanded and went on to do other things. Much more than the money we were able to raise, the event was built through this wide network of personal relationships and ongoing conversations, largely underpinned by Philip Magazine, who was Christina and Jeff, who are integrated in the process. So we configured presentations for the conference along questions of time, intimacy, the influences of the state and the market, the promises, utopian or otherwise, that we make through our work, and the dissolution of work into life or anti-institutional strategies. Our survey of the field of artistic institutions was designed to probe conditions that give rise to both the physical infrastructure associated with a center or a space and the informal adoption of an art activity on any scale. Like today's events, I by A, as we called it, was primarily a gathering of bodies. About 400 people came to Vancouver from across the world to meet one another and to discuss their works and their perspective on artistic practice. As is the usual sort of result of a conference, when they gathered in person, many of the attendees disagreed with us, both with us and with each other. And more importantly, they sort of turned over the frameworks that we made, rethought our questions, moved our chairs around, resisted all of our bureaucracies, and turned conversations into directions that we did not anticipate. And in considering this now, I think that's exactly what we asked them for. We wanted them to come to surprise us into reconsidering what we thought we might think of when we thought about these kinds of art practices. So today I'm going to share a little bit of insight about the conference, but before I do that, I'm going to speak a little bit to the context of art in Vancouver. This is an image from 221A Artist-Run Center, the most sort of one of the youngest artist-run centers in town. I just wanted to also put it into perspective that Canada is a country that is about 6,000 kilometers across. It takes about 63 hours or like 8 days, roughly, to drive across Canada. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories and about 35 million people. So just to kind of orient yourself a little bit, for those of you who haven't been to Canada or to North America, to kind of have a sense. So that just to give you a sort of sense of where people were coming from when they came to this conference. We're on one side of the coast and people came from across. I've sort of previously been asked to speak of institutions by artists from the perspective of community. I find that notion to be intertwined with notions of autonomy that we're addressing today. And when I was asked by 2 artists last year, Honey Beckerby and Sawada Demanovic, to prepare a similar talk for Copenhagen for a conference called Artist Run, I found it quite useful actually to begin with this concept of the polis that they had been engaging with. It was outlined kind of on their sort of press materials. It's a notion that comes from the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. So Honey and Sawada had offered this quote from her writings on the human condition, and specifically she defines the polis as this space of appearance where a public community is formed through the, sort of both speech and action together. Prefiguring governments and various forms of institutions, this idea of the polis tries to lay out the stakes of how a kind of active participation leads to a productive public realm. She uses terms like the work of our hands and drives home the notion that any sense of collective political and social being resides in an ongoing action and speech together, and on never losing the characteristic of potential or the requirement to continuously activate this speech and action. So in short, Arendt seems to view the polis as this practice. It's a practice that we must upkeep at all times. Her goal in writing was to deconstruct notions of sort of power and oppression, but also to point to the human capacity for open and shared social organization. Her argument is, I suppose, that we can be the bearers of new realities. Such a perspective also appears within the impulses that make artist-run spaces. Artists Active artists create spaces or situations to fit the realities that they wish to construct. Like Arendt's description of the polis, these do not need to necessarily last forever, but they're dependent on a practice of activation. So artist-run structures are therefore not necessarily a physical building, but the practice of combining intention, articulation, and a realization. So when we speak of artist-run culture in Canada, we refer specifically to a history of artistic self-empowerment and to the forming of new galleries, ventures, studio spaces that accommodate art activity that no other place could do. Artist-run centres in Canada were built as an alternative to the existing structure of galleries, museums, commercial spaces that did not recognize the possibilities and values of experimental art forms. So at the time, this is in the late 60s, early 70s, we're talking about the dematerialized art object, movements like fluxus, correspondence art, things that are non-commodity. Performance sort of fits into that category as well. So artists were in culture that took root in the mid-1960s, and I'm going to start showing a few slides from this. Leading into this period, just to give another little contextual bit, the art scene was sort of dominated by the group of seven, who, like a group of landscape painters that are kind of the major figures of Canadian art, like all Canadians know who they are, basically. And they'd recently sort of settled into their golden years. They're entering their 60s, their 70s, and they're on the galleries advisory boards, and they're kind of the professionals, the professors in art schools. They hold a lot of sway with how the public comes to think of and know art. And their particular brand of art and their identity was quite apart from a growing kind of coterie of younger artists who were interested in counterculture, consciousness raising, Buddhism, agrarianism, wilderness worship, LSD, and sexual exploitation. I took that from somewhere. Known primarily as a kind of West Coast thing, this was the social and aesthetic context for art in Vancouver in the 60s, maybe not for the whole country, it's pretty varied. But where artists were gathering, renting storefronts, putting on performances, and they were drawing in regional audiences and participants. They're also responding to the notions that are being offered by Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who famously declared that the medium is the message. So artists, musicians, dancers, writers began embracing technological exploration and experimentation to reconsider what an artistic medium is, to say that perhaps it's anything that shapes and controls the scale or form of human association and action. They had a fascination with new technologies, particularly television, radio networks, and the advent of video, which were then sort of ushered in as tools and tools for artists in this era of experimentation. So in the 1960s, Vancouver was small and interdisciplinary kind of out of necessity, and venues in the city included this place, the Cellar Jazz Bar, sort of legendary space. It became known for supporting kind of interdisciplinary media presentations, and another space named the Sound Gallery, which was a storefront gallery that became a space for musicians and artists and gave rise to this festival, the Trips Festival, which was also quite legendary. It was a big public spectacle that featured the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin, but also this like multimedia sensorium of over like 25,000 square feet of screen space with music, film slides, and the whole moving liquid projection, which I wish there were pictures of that I could find because I have never found any. So this activity led to the formation of a new sort of institution, which later came to be known as Canada's first artist-run centre, and that was Intermedia. So Intermedia is something, again, of a kind of legend. These are all of our like forebearers. So in the Canadian context and in Vancouver especially, it was an artist-driven experiment in the production of art that crossed boundaries with sound, motion, dance, film, and new media. It was an important group, specifically in Vancouver, but also across Canada it was kind of like an artist think tank. So in this new era, it was populated by poets and sculptors and musicians and dancers and filmmakers, but also scientists and engineers and other supporters. So it was a real trying to like really bridge gaps between art and life. The project has a backing, at that time, the project had the backing of a prominent sort of figures in the scene. So, you know, big curators at the Vancouver Art Gallery were vouching for these people. and helping them to get what was basically the first allocation for artist-run centre in Canada from the Canada Council for the Arts. So in 1967, they received $40,000 with no strings attached. And effectively it would be today about 250,000 Canadian dollars. And so maybe translated to Swedish kroners, that would be about 1,650,000 kroners. I don't know if that helps you to understand the scale of like what that investment would be, but if you think about it, that's quite a lot of money for some group of artists that had no track record and were just basically asked to do whatever they wanted. So despite the support, the space that they operated was not actually a public space. The group leased a 4-story building. I'm going to show you, it's this, where they carried on a kind of artistic experimentation and activity over which they had complete control. You can think of it as a self-made art studio. The impact on the Vancouver art scene was, however, substantial. The group generated many public events. I'm just going to show you this one. So these events largely kind of came to be known as Intermedia Nights, and they happened at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And they sort of borrowed the visual language of the geodesic dome and a lot of sort of utopian culture. This is kind of inflected by a visit that Buckminster Fuller made to Vancouver in like sort of like the late 60s. So that was happening at the university. So there's quite a lot of cross-pollination between the art scene and the universities at that time. And their work, was untypical. It started to seem to characterize the moment in a way that other art gallery shows and other things that were popping up in the art world were not. So suddenly the artists in Intermedia were, sort of seen as this new wave of things that were going on in the community. And they developed through this funding and through their project a stable of new technology. So they brought the first Portapack video camera to Vancouver. And then 3 years later, they dissolved. So there was a personal tragedy. The members were left in a kind of disarray, all moved on to do new projects, and the film and video equipment in particular was sort of redistributed. There were many new sort of organizations founded, Intermedia Press, there was, there was like a media production, which eventually became Metro Media, and then 2 artist-run centers were founded kind of out of the ruins of Intermedia. So I'll just say, before I start getting into them, I'll say that the political climate in Canada in the 1970s really favored social programs and community support. It's maybe the closest we'd ever be getting to Sweden in terms of what the government was willing to do to invest in culture. So the funding for the arts was part of an agenda, of, like kind of liberal agenda of social welfare, and artists were actively setting up their own spaces, were quickly able to sort of navigate the opportunities that were brought forward and used it to make something lasting. A. Bronson, who I spoke about with someone else today, an important Canadian artist and a member of the queer interdisciplinary collective General Idea, very important to also the Canadian art myths. He figures prominently into this history of the dawning of Artist Run, as he was both actively part of it through A-Space and through his association with the groups coming out of Intermedia, but also as a writer. He diagnosed this era pretty succinctly, and I'll quote him here. So this was a unique period of massive development in Canada, responding to the unique geographical and political situation. Here, something happened that happened nowhere else. The linear construction of the country, the reliance on media, the lack of a Canadian identity, the aggressive cultural domination of American popular media, the lack of any real art market at all, the impossibility of competing internationally with New York's hype system and the machinery of American politics pushing American art down the throats of the entire Western world, the McLuhanistic policy that I mentioned previously of making of the Canadian government in the mid to late 60s, this was all a constellation of unlikely catalysts that crystallized into the post-capital art scene in Canada. So his listing of factors here points out a kind of cultural climate that gave rise to a new breed of art space where artists had funds to explore and experiment and follow their own pursuits without ever having the expectation of sales. and space for such creation began popping up all throughout Canada. So A Space, as I mentioned, in Toronto, Clouds and Water Gallery in Calgary, Saw Gallery in Ottawa, Parachute, Montreal, Open Space, Victoria. These are just a few of the ones that were founded basically during this moment. And they all formed themselves into a network. So it sounds like you're on your way to doing something similar here, but essentially the association they founded was called ANPAC, a National Association of Nonprofit Art Centers, and it was founded to help connect and represent the affiliated centers in their regional areas to stay connected in such a vast country. There were also regional associations that were founded during this time, so PARC, the one that we were sort of seeded, funded by, the Pacific Association of Artist-Run Centers handles sort of the BC region. So these associations across Canada kind of worked together at that time to publish. They did a catalog each year of what the artist-run centers were across the country, just data gathering, publishing some pictures, who was involved. It's a great record, in fact, of that moment. And then later turned that sort of impulse into a magazine, which was called Parallelogram. And it was sort of named after the impulse to have these parallel galleries, galleries that were separate from but equal to other institutions. So in Vancouver, artists pushing this connection and communication were operating under this kind of almost utopian ideals, and they were creating their own informal networks. They were really working with an art practice that pursued social impulses. The particular character of these impulses on the West Coast is evident in a work like this. This is a picture, one of the many pictures generated by the Color Bar Research Project. So in this image, you're seeing a kind of naked swim frolic with the color bars, which were units of color derived as like these small wooden tools for indexing and measuring light. They began to appear in videos and photographs and films, as well as in galleries as artistic tools for sort of formal gestures with color and light. And I'm showing this to kind of underscore a little bit how some artists were looking into art as technology already, a kind of measure of reality, but while kind of meanwhile pursuing a kind of countercultural narrative. So pushing it out into, you know, off onto Hornby Island or wherever. So art making was sort of placed at the center of a social ecology that included like leisure, science, community, and health. So picking up on that dissolution of intermedia and the energies of that space were redirected almost immediately into these two new experimental art spaces which opened. This one is the Western Front. So Western Front, I'm just going to speak about two of them. So Western Front was founded in 1973 by 8 artists who were friends and variously involved in the arts. So architect, musician, composer, visual artists, different kinds. They secured funds from their families and some connections to purchase this lodge, which remains today. It was at that time a former community gathering space of the Knights of Pythias, which is a sort of fraternal order, much like the Freemasons, but a bit more working class. And they took this space over and founded what they called the Western Front, and what now remains basically one of Canada's first enduring spaces for experimental media. They lived and worked there. It was a production center that spawned 40 years of gatherings, dinners, conversations, residencies, dance performances, poetry readings, screenings, media events, publishing, and exhibitions. Their collaborative spirit led to such spectacles as this, which was one of the collective members, Vincent Trazov, masquerading as Mr. Peanut, where he and other Western Fronters ran a satirical mayoral campaign in 1974. I think they got like 6% of the vote or something like that. And over the course of the history, they developed this real rabble-rousing sort of performance persona. It's now operated as a contemporary art space, has a media archive, there's an exhibitions program, a music program, and a media program. It's a bit more typical. It's no longer run by a collective of artists, or we're just curators. We're not the same. The second center that I wanted to talk about briefly, it sort of came directly out of Intermedia, is Video In. It's now known as Vivo Media Arts Center. It was primarily dedicated to video. It grew out of a conference event that happened in Vancouver in 1972, as well as sort of a kind of mashup of those people with Intermedia people, where basically artists who came to this conference were asked to donate. Instead of having an entrance fee, they all donated a videotape, which then got dubbed and turned into a local library, which became the basis for the Satellite Video Exchange Society, which then formed an institution in order to distribute those tapes and to build on them. So Video In became a library and production space, and the West Coast link on a distribution chain, like a network of people who are distributing video across the country. And catalogs were sort of like directories, became an important kind of process at that time. Yeah, I'm definitely going to go over by 5 minutes, just so you know. Okay, I'll try to keep it short. So throughout the 70s, new publications, new art spaces, recurring events began to happen. So in Vancouver, this means at least a dozen new art centers. This is from Pumps, a media and exhibition live workspace that spawned the Gina Show, which these are some clips from the Gina Show. The Helen Pitt Gallery, which was an exhibition space instigated by students and professors from the Vancouver School of Art, local art college. This is the Orr Gallery, founded in 1983 with Ian Wallace' famous At Work piece that he did in the window, founded by the artist Lai Wan and later taken over by Ken Lum, subsequently passed on each year to a new artist until it became more of a traditional institution. Art Speak, focusing on the intersection of art and literature. This is kind of a smattering of others. Grunt, KSW, which is the Kootenai School of Writing, and Dynamo Access Gallery. So some of these ventures failed, others thrived. Financial support for the arts in Canada were sort of flowering and flowing during this period. Federal social programs like the Local Initiatives Program, a widely used source of funds for community-based projects, as well as the opportunity for youth grants, and enabled a kind of generation of young artists to be employed in a flexible way, so sort of temporary, intense amount of money that you could get and then later go on like social assistance and come back onto these grants is sort of how it worked. It was also an era of really a much quieter moment in Vancouver in terms of real estate. So when citizens in Vancouver could actually live and work inexpensively, leaving artists a little bit more financial flexibility to access or create spaces for studios and presentation activity. So as this changed, impulses to self-organize remain the same. Political and social circumstances evolving throughout the 1980s brought in more fiscally conservative policies on a provincial and federal level. But at the time, it also became apparent that founding artist-run centers wasn't just about building an art gallery. It was also just a process of enabling the overlapping concerns of art and life to create whatever structures were needed. So describing a period in the 1980s, Lorna Brown, who was one of the instigators of this conference, she says, consensus decision-making, collective production, communal art life arrangements, and the like were directly related to concurrent social and political movements like feminism, gay rights, anti-racist activism, as well as a need for exhibition space. Self-organization linked to labor movement models can be seen in the term cultural workers, and the street marches of the Artists' Union in Ontario and elsewhere, and the Vancouver Artists League. All of these organizations were part of the artist-run context. Agitation for economic rights for artists is evident in the work of CARFAC, which I previously mentioned, and anti-censorship organization disputes over public access to airwaves and against media monopolies were also a critical part of this discourse. So in short, as artist-run spaces continued, they remained relevant for as long as they formed space where active alterity or sometimes dissent could take root. These places play a very important role in the coming of age of many artists in Vancouver, providing opportunities to network, share knowledge, and become civic actors in whichever way they choose. So the forging of more open communities promised by centers like Western Front, whose earliest articulation of its purpose was to promote and encourage the role of art in determining the cultural ecology, implies an agency beyond the walls of a gallery. It continues to be important to maintain this perspective, a perspective on this potential that for an art space to act as a portal, that an art space may act as a portal through which artists address the community at large. The particular history of Vancouver is continuously added to by new collectives, and often younger artists kick up when they don't see anything around that describes them or their interests. So that's a lot about the Vancouver context, and now I'm going to turn a little bit to institutions by artists. We consciously acknowledged this history when we worked toward creating the event, but I worked on a series of historical profiles, and then we consciously moved away from dealing with this subject matter when we did the conference. So we really dealt instead with a contemporary international context, turning away from our own local histories and funding models. I see you. In 2012, Institutions by Artists, we gathered together 50 speakers, about 400 audience members, and we had the event over 3 days in October. So we started with notions of institutional critique and attempts to widen this idea to include individual and ephemeral practices. We focused not on institutions, but on artists and the way they form institutions as part of their work. This included individual projects that might adopt the mode of an institution to get work done, like Clairefontaine, or collaborative autonomous approaches to pedagogy, such as the Copenhagen Free University, some of you may know. We involve self-funded backyard art spaces like the Feminist Art Gallery in Toronto, and artists like Dirk Fleischmann, German artist based in Korea, who has started several legitimate incorporated businesses as a means of funding and producing his works. I was going to show you some clips, but we won't have time, so I will encourage you to look at them on the website. This is arcpost.ca. So we built this website and it houses all of the material from the conference. We also had a festival during the event, so sort of like a 2-week wraparound for the event of different events that happened in Vancouver. We published a book, which I brought a few copies for people to look at, and can leave them behind if anyone wants one, or you can fight over them. And in year 1 and 2, we also did some commissions. So this was a film we commissioned by Anton Vidokul and Palin Tan with Or Gallery called 2084. It's a kind of science fiction. Second was called Study One by Artifact Institute, this group who did a kind of report on Artists Run for our conference. The third was Call to Order, a score musical composition that became sort of the musical interludes in between panels and up and down for the debates that we held. And then the final one was this, it's really hard to see it, but it's called Resources Cenotaph. It's a concrete poetry print series cataloging the names of all the defunct, like ended artist-run centers in Vancouver. So getting to kind of a summary here, I found it kind of impossible to state what the outcomes of the project were, even though that was what you guys sort of asked me to do, alongside the artist-run galleries that I spoke about that form a kind of a layer of institutional history. We begin to address the equally important kind of plurality of institutions that are in constant state of becoming in our sort of era, you know. Alongside artist-run spaces and magazines came associations, businesses, bureaus, schools, clubs, institutes, centers, like all these different ways of making an artist institution. And they seem to redefine the mode and the mold of collaboration to meet new challenges. So as all this is kind of a way of saying, like, we thought there were a lot of different plural things going on, but we didn't see anything that was like, oh, it's like this now. I do want to offer you, this is my last bit, I do want to offer you the words of Vincent Bonin again. Vincent is a curator and a historian and a writer working in Canada. He's based in Montreal, and he was, more than anyone, diagnosing the present state of challenges that we now face in Canada 40 years after forming some of these networks. He says, a perverse rekindling of the self-management paradigm is heavily influenced by neoliberalism, where the alternative grassroots organizations function as links in the chain that consolidates a system based on individual entrepreneurship and meritocracy rather than a spirit of collectivism. Rejecting both models, certain groups of artists attempt to circumvent bureaucratic red tape by setting up in motion a para-institutional projects that mostly develop without recourse to government money. These groups generally follow the now exhausted model of the gift economy that allowed collectives from the 1970s, which I was describing, to operate in a relatively autonomous manner. The life expectancy of those projects depends thus largely on the investments and commitments of both the founding members and the counter-publics that form around them. Some groups demonstrate a firmly leftist allegiance, while others disassociate themselves from politics altogether. Their initiators of these projects are essentially they essentially short-circuit meritocracies and instead just set up spaces where exhibitions, events, or meetings can take place. So this is the promise, the space of potential that exists as a commitment as well to self-criticality, and in whatever form that takes, a constant kind of re-evaluation of whether the structures that we are building do what we need them to do and live up to the ideas set forth by our forebears or surpass them. Thanks.